Tonight, FDA members will discuss freedom and democracy in relation to the 22 countries audited by the FDA and its global electoral fairness audit. Present for the podcast tonight is an 8-person team of various members of the organization: Stephen, Zeb, Dale, Antonio, Dan, Kyle, Liza are all here tonight and will be sharing their insights and perspectives on this really, really important topic. I'm going to open the floor now to everyone to get this going.
So I think one of the most important aspects that we have to distinguish in this topic today is the difference between democracy and freedom. From some of the articles that we have in front of us here, we've been able to note that freedom and democracy aren't necessarily related, although many people may think that that's true. Simply put, democracy is just a method of deciding who governs those countries, whereas freedoms are given in constitutional reform to the members of that country to make sure that their freedoms of speech, of their human rights are actually enforced and given the right to do so in those countries.
I agree with those points, Dale. Looking at democracy, if we go to the pure form from Plato, Socrates, going back to Greek civilization, democracy is about demos, the people, the people's will. Lincoln's statement, of the people, by the people, for the people, is all about the will of the people. Freedom is completely different. It's dealing with individual freedoms, societal freedoms, governmental freedoms, and on and on. Though freedom is linked to democracy, the two concepts are different. One is the will of the people, and one is freedom. So that's really important. Does anyone have anything to add on that?
See, I would say that the two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. However, freedom is a necessary condition for democracy.
One of them.
But
it's not the only condition for democracy.
I would say that it's a foundation, though.
It's one of them. I wouldn't say it's the foundation.
Freedom does not exist. Can you have a democracy?
What about fairness or equality? If all you have is freedom in a state of nature, how can you have a democracy?
But on the topic of freedom, without freedom, can you have a democracy?
It's definitely integral to it, but there's other components to a democracy as well. That's my point. Freedom is not the only seed to democracy.
Oh no, definitely not.
That's what I'm saying. But definitely you need aspects of freedom in my view. We already saw in the FDA reports up to now, we've done 22 countries. The countries that are doing well tend to be egalitarian. France, Venezuela, New Zealand didn't do as well, but it was in the positive range. It had egalitarian equality aspects to it. And what we saw, the countries that aren't doing well, all the way down to many of the Middle Eastern countries, were completely infringing on freedom, the Middle East. But then if you look at certain Western countries, they had too much freedom, and which were allowing minorities to take over. So I think so an issue we're having here in terms of freedom and democracy is having too much freedom in the case of Canada, the U.S., Sweden, countries like that. And then if we look at countries in the Middle East, they have
totalitarian rule.
Totalitarian, authoritarian rule where they're completely sucking the freedom out. And then you got countries kind of in between that, France and Venezuela, which have more egalitarian societies, and they're excelling, and they're actually putting limits on freedom.
What was Denmark's score?
It was around just below 40%.
Denmark is the most egalitarian country by the UN's standard Gini coefficient.
Yeah, it depends how you define that. In terms of electoral fairness, when we looked at them, they had no restrictions on the media. They had no restrictions on electoral finance. They had all kinds of freedoms, so they were marked down. There's 6 billionaires in Denmark, and there is income equality there, and people with more money can have more say.
That's a perfect example of relating democracy and freedom as unequal.
Mm-hmm.
I think a key issue here too. I've been looking at this, as we all have all week. I looked at the Venice Commission. They have guidelines for European democracy. It's called the Code of Good Practice in Electoral Times. I was looking at that document. It's very similar to what we're doing. They talk about equal opportunity. They're talking about equal opportunity. Equal opportunity must be guaranteed for parties and candidates alike. This entails neutral attitude of state authorities, in particular regard to election campaign, coverage by the media, in particular publicly owned media, and also public funding of parties and campaigns. So this is totally linked into what we're doing. These are limits on freedom. These are actually concrete limits that are promoting egalitarian equality. There's also, they talk about equality may be strict or proportional. They talk about how you can restrict freedom. You can either do a concrete restriction on it, or you can do it through a proportional representation. And then what's interesting here, they talk about in conformity with freedom of expression, legal provisions should be made to ensure that there is a minimum access to privately owned audiovisual media. So that's something we are looking at. Again, it's guaranteeing access. So the media doesn't have complete freedom to say, no, we're not going to allow you to broadcast your political views on it. So they're talking about guaranteeing access. This is infringing on freedom, so to speak, of the media. Right, is promoting that equality. And then the important thing here, they talk about restrictions of these freedoms must have a basis in law, be in the public interest, and comply with the principles of proportionality. So anytime you're restricting freedom, it has to be based in law, has to be in the public interest, and it has to be proportional to what you're restricting. So basically, this document is advocating a limit on freedom in democracy, and they're providing a means of doing it.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I mean, I think in order to have a democracy, to some extent, you have to limit freedoms. It may sound anti-democratic, but a perfect example is the audit we did on France. I mean, they had like a $5,000 spending limit on people who want to contribute to their party of choice. There may be a side that argues, you know what, you're limiting the freedom of those who are rich. But it's done for a reason. It's done to maintain that equality. And seeing as equality is one of the tenets of democracy, I think you have to have that fine balance between the two. And, in some societies like the U.S., where, freedom is something that's talked about at length, too much freedom, you can argue, is ruining that society in a way. Look at the corporations, what they do. They have total freedom to do whatever they want. And it in the end, it's not doing positive things for that society. So.
Yeah, interesting. I'm going to bring up another important mechanism to limit freedom in society, and I'm going to refer to the Canadian society. In the Supreme Court of Canada, they actually have a criteria in it. It's called the Oakes test, and it's used it's a criteria used to determine whether the government can create a law which restricts freedom, to see whether it's actually constitutional and should go through. So basically the test is the law must have sufficient important objective in terms of the society. The law must be rationally connected to the objective. And the critical third point here, the law must not infringe a right more than is necessary to meet the objective. And finally, the fourth point, the law must not have a disproportional severe effect. My issue with this test in the context of Canada, it's all hinged on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. In the first article, they talk about, quote, freedom and democracy, but there's no explanation of what democracy is or what freedom is, so it's subject to interpretation. There's no mention in the Charter of Rights and Freedom in Canada as well. Political equality, egalitarianism, fairness, electoral fairness. So I feel like there's kind of like a bias in that charter to freedom. It's lacking the egalitarian aspects of French society or even what's written in the Venezuelan constitution and electoral laws. So this test, though it's protecting freedom, I feel like it's weakened by the charter itself, because it's all based on the charter, and it's all based on appointments to the Supreme Court, which have been partisan appointments from either the Conservatives or the Liberal parties on top of that. So this whole process gets weakened here, I would argue, in the context of Canada. It loses, even though this is a concrete way to determine whether a law goes through. If the basis is weak and the people deciding it have been there through partisan appointments, and they have, it's kind of undermining it there. And it's like I said, it doesn't deal with the egalitarian aspects of freedom in this context.
So you think that if freedom and equality were defined, that would make it a little bit more clear?
Well,
would that be the?
I think if they were a bit more like the French, egalitarians was actually part of one of their fundamental values. Mm-hmm. All we have in the Canadian Constitution and the Charter of Rights is freedom and democracy, democratic society. It couldn't be more vague. Mm. And obviously the emphasis is on freedom. And that's what we have in this society. And the democracy is being impacted. As we saw in the Canadian Electoral Study Report, the private media in Canada has a free reign to do whatever they want during an election. And they have unfair impact on the Canadian electoral discourse. So it's kind of rooted in the Charter, it's rooted in the Constitution, it's rooted in the Supreme Court judges that have been appointed by the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party. And this links back to another point I think we need to look at. There's limits in freedom in society. There's accountability, there's law, there's separation of powers. Like in the U.S., you got the Congress, you got the executive, you got the judiciary. But it seems to me that in Canada, just use that as a case study. The Conservatives right now have a majority government. There's no real check on them in the actual Parliament because they have majority votes. Yet they only got less than 25% of the total vote, if you include the non-voters as well. But if you look at the judiciary, it's supposed to be a check on them, but they're all appointments from the Liberals and Conservatives. So where's the separation there? And then you rely on the major media as a check on them, but they're actually connected to the government and producing their articles. And not only that, the Conservatives have actually appointed some of the media to the Senate on top of it. Yeah. So in Canada, there's no separation. It's unbelievable in this country. Freedom is completely abused here. The U.S. are way ahead of us, at least in terms of the separation of the Congress and the executive. They have the same problem in the judiciary, where they're appointments of the Republicans and Democrats. So where's the separation there? The only separation would be is which one's a Republican, which one's a Democrat, and what's the breakdown on it. So these are issues I think we need to look at. I'm also concerned about another issue, how democracy is being abused, the freedom aspect. You can see the U.S. government, people always, I think the infamous one now is Obama said, we welcome the cry of freedom from anyone, where anyone in the world, so they're supporting Syrians right now. But when it came to the Bahrainians, they were completely sidelined. There was nothing there to help them. They were crushed by the Bahraini monarchy and the Saudi government. Was the U.S. standing up for them in any way? No. So we can see how it's very selective too, how it's being applied worldwide. That's only one example. So I think it. Sure.
One
Go.
quick question. You said that the abuse of freedom in Canada in particular is letting minorities take over. Can you just quickly clarify what you mean by minorities?
So I think in the context of the major media, it would be the minority in terms of the two families that own most of the major media in Canada, and also the media companies themselves. They are minorities. They are not the majority of Canadian society. Those are minority corporate entities.
Oh, that's what you mean.
That are having an unfair influence on the electoral discourse.
Or like you mean the rich?
The rich, you could argue,
Yeah.
if you want to be more specific on it. And we saw the same thing in New Zealand. The major media, it's unbelievable what's going on there. They just privatized the public media, and now the major media is basically dominating the electoral discourse in that country. It's atrocious.
With unlimited freedoms in the media aspect.
Exactly. But if you look at France, they actually limit the concentration of the media. And ironically, I was looking at some right-wing think tank reports on democracy, and they were marking France down because of that. So I think, unfortunately, it seems like freedom's being hijacked by the corporate sector, the major corporate sector in certain Western countries. And it's being used, freedom is dominating democracy. Freedom is integral to democracy. So freedom of the press, and I'm going to stay clear, I don't think it's consistent with pure democracy or the will of the people to have a major media dominating electoral discourse. That is not in the interest of the people. What is in their interest is to be as informed as possible. And that means having a pluralistic media content. Any comments on any of this?
I think in the context of Canada, it depends where you see this locus of freedom, if you see it based in the individual or based in the group.
Yeah.
Because completely different outcomes for both. Like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for example, recognizes specific groups in the document. Does that give them, more freedom, less freedom?
But it's applied to everyone as a whole, that charter.
It's applied to, it's applied, to individuals, but it does give some group recognition. You know what I mean? Recognizing a group, does that give that group more freedom, more ability?
It does, in the case of major media. That's what I'm arguing. That it's actually being abused and it's harming our democracy. So it's actually the first article, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, is actually in contradiction. They go, freedom in a democratic society.
Mm-hmm.
That's all they say.
Well, that's what I was going after, is if you give freedom to individuals, and then you give freedom to groups, now does that group have the right to infringe on individuals' freedom for the benefit of that group?
But they are allowing that in the charter.
Mm-hmm.
It's very tough restrictions to limit that. And I'm arguing that groups are actually harming democracy and therefore the majority of the people.
By group recognition, that's
exactly.
I would
totally.
argue.
For obscuring the individual?
Yeah, I have a
Yeah.
problem with the charter in that regard, simply because it doesn't guarantee individual rights and freedoms, simply because it contradicts itself in just mentioning specific. To be fair, the groups that are recognized were founding parties of the country. However, that undermines freedom, which, in my opinion, undermines democracy.
It's a really good point. It's not just democracy being undermined, but also individuals in it.
Yeah.
It could be somebody who's supporting a small party, and they're completely sidelined.
See, for me,
Yeah.
freedom is a necessary condition for democracy, no matter how you look at it. And by recognizing those groups, you're undermining that the individual freedom upon which democracy is built on.
Of course, but also I would argue there's also equality, and equality is part of democracy and fairness.
Mm-hmm. But when you say to when you allocate freedom as on the individual level, no one person can have more freedom than another person. That is the very holistic approach to egalitarianism. Everyone's equal.
Yeah.
Your freedom is
Yeah.
equal.
Yeah.
You can do specific things that, you know what I mean, as long as you're not infringing on someone else's freedom.
Yeah.
But when you give groups rights, then they're kind of doubling up on the freedom. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
No, it's a good point. So you're talking about individuals and groups have their own.
Yeah.
It's almost like a corporate entity, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Go ahead, Go ahead.
Yeah, I think you've touched on something there because with legal entities, it is kind of like they are doubling up on the freedom, right? And in some cases, the individuals that comprise that entity lessen their liability as well.
Yeah.
So
Throughout Canadian
Excellent
constitutional law, there's been cases where these groups have used their recognition in the charter to gain an up in society.
It's unbelievable. It's so poorly written, that charter. The fact that they haven't defined democratic society is inexcusable. There should be almost 2 full paragraphs of articles defining what that is. And then we wouldn't be harping over these issues. The fact that it's not defined, it leaves the door wide open. Again, freedom of interpretation. And this is a serious issue. We got a government in Canada in power, and they only got 39.6% of those who voted, the support.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at their percentage of the vote and the percentage of the seats they have in the House, they have over 160 seats.
What, first past the post?
I know. It's unbelievable. There should be a minimum standard of 50%. If you're going to get the votes, you should at least have 50% of the votes. That's how they run it in France. They actually have a second runoff. If there's no one with 50% of the votes, the 2 top candidates go into a second runoff.
When we think of the Canadian, in the audits we've done, we see the Constitution as a basis for that society and that governing system. So if you look at it in the context of Canada, the Constitution and the Charter, by recognizing these groups, French, has, one could say maybe that the way in which ridings are drawn, gerrymandering, and the allotment of seats, maybe that's a product of the Constitution in a sense.
same could be said for New Zealand as well, right? When we were looking at the Maori population.
Because it does give you more legal power,
What does?
being recognized in a constitution.
Yeah. And they tend to, like Venezuela, recognize the natives.
And the same in Canada, right?
Yeah.
But you can't say that the natives are getting a significant
Allocation.
of representation in Canada.
Nor
But-
are they in New Zealand.
But the French are,
Yeah.
and same with Eastern Canada,
Yeah.
opposed to Western Canada.
Right.
But they're not recognized in the charter.
So what's going on here? Why are these countries so deficient? Like this seems so basic to me. Egalitarianism. Like you gotta. Is this like a corporate takeover? Like that's been perpetuated over time.
That's exactly it.
Is this I'm sorry, I'm not into conspiracy theory, but this seems like we're being hijacked.
But I think that you're completely right, and it has to do with the drafters of these constitutions and constitutional documents. By recognizing specific people, they're giving them political clout in the long term. Unequal freedom,
Yeah.
if you will, and that unequal freedom manifests itself in the organizations and perpetuates into a product that
And then they keep brainwashing people about freedom.
And
They keep linking it, like the U.S. or Canada. They keep,
exactly.
anytime they bring up democracy, they link it to freedom.
But do you think in those states, especially in the U.S., the whole concept of freedom is kind of like a philosophical belief in, given their history and given the West's history with communism, because anyone who says anything about equality or an egalitarian society, they're labeled socialist or they're labeled communist. Do you think it has to do a lot with just the Western identity and just capitalism?
Oh, it's almost mythologized, right?
Yeah,
It's,
to that extent.
Fantasized
Yeah.
to a certain
yeah.
extent.
And does
that's
that
a better word.
Yeah.
And does that lead to what we're seeing now in a system that doesn't serve its people fairly
Yeah.
because of this whole brainwashing type of jingoism when it relates to freedom as a concept, as a theoretical construct?
Yeah, it's even. I would argue it's even expanded, or to the point where it's completely hijacked.
Yeah, and
by
I mean,
corporate entities.
Like you're saying, the political discourse in the States, when it revolving around freedom, it's kind of almost detached from reality in a sense.
it is.
Yeah,
It's
completely.
Like they lost the dictionary. You can't say freedom, or even try and limit freedom for the greater good, without getting criticized.
Well, freedom, I think, is in the U.S. especially. It's a magic word almost. You can have the word freedom in your speech, and suddenly you're a hero, right? And you can use the word freedom to attack, to go and get involved in military misadventures all over the world. But if you're fighting for freedom, that's okay.
Yeah.
So it's almost become this buzzword almost.
But the irony is that the U.S. is limiting freedom of people all over the world. You could argue. Every time they're invading a country, every time they're dictating to a country, whether through the State Department or through the IMF, through the World Bank, they're limiting freedom. Every time a small party in the U.S. has no chance, they're limiting their freedom. So they're selective in their freedom, aren't they?
It's strategic.
They created almost a hierarchy of freedom. And now they got this hierarchy made, and they're making sure no one else...
And this goes on to the point that you said with France earlier on. Like, we'll start with like the U.S. I mean, I don't have the stats in front of me, but I don't remember the last time that a Republican or a Democrat wasn't voted into office. I don't know if an independent party has ever been voted into office. Don't quote me on that one. But same thing as in Canada. Like, when I went to vote, I had a choice of 4 parties to vote, and that was in Saskatchewan. I'm sure it was a lot different from when you guys voted. I bet you the 4 people you guys had a choice of were different than my 4. So I mean, when you have our freedom to vote, basically, our freedom of democracy is basically limited. And like when you said with France, how they need 50% votes to have their democratic government voted in. That's a great point, because actually in this article, it's called "Debunking the Myth of Freedom and Democracy in America." The author states that the fundamental flaw in a true democracy is that the majority is unrestrained. And so then it goes on to say, if 51% of the population voted to harm or seize the property of the other 49%, who's going to protect the 49%? And when you put it in perspective of Canada, you said it was 30-some-odd% that the Conservatives got voted in, so who's looking after the other 65% or 60-odd% of the citizens? So
Traditionally, democracy, one of the faults of it is kind of tyranny of the majority by definition. You're gonna, if you define democracy in that sense, it's not working correctly in Canada. It's not functioning right.
Because it's missing the egalitarian component.
Tyranny of almost a minority.
It is. It's unbelievable, and it's also it's actually the word, like Zeb said. It's become part of the system. It just keeps getting spat out, and
I think that their fantasization of democracy is embedded into liberal democracy and their ideology in the States. In a sense, I think that's kind of the foundation of the country.
yeah, but yet they call themselves a democracy.
A liberal democracy, right? That's
Doesn't
a
matter.
textbook liberal democracy.
A democracy is about the will
is-
of the people.
Is liberty,
Lincoln
freedom.
established that. He's not the only one.
But liberal democracy is about freedom, liberty,
And it's not about the will of the people, you would argue?
Well, it is, but I would argue it's more about liberty and freedom.
How
The
how could
ability-
you separate the two? Of the people, by the people, for the people.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kernel of democracy. Going back to the Greeks. If you want to take a scalpel and put freedom in there, you're totally undermining what democracy is.
I think it's their own skewed version of
Yeah,
democracy.
it's liberal democracy.
But again,
Different kinds
is this
of
part of a system of the rich manipulating what democracy is?
What I think their ideal is embedded in some sort of an underlying truth that freedom and liberty are good. However, the way it's actually played out is not.
But how can you say it's good? It's being limited every day in society.
Yeah, it is.
There's
but
limits.
That's not
All the laws
intent.
limit freedom.
Mhm.
There's no state of nature in the U.S. They have all kinds of laws.
Exactly. And the more laws you have, the more you're.
And they're
limited.
actually favoring, the electoral laws are favoring the status quo.
Definitely.
So it's not being applied consistently there. Again, I would argue that it's missing an egalitarian component. And that's why a lot of these Western countries, we're seeing it'd be even hard to call them democracies. You can't separate egalitarianism from democracy.
But are we talking egalitarian freedom in society or in government?
In both. They're in both. All the laws of society are reflecting that. It's like what Kyle said. The basic commercial laws, Kyle.
But then if you have more... I'm not saying that I'm a fan of small government, but then if you had a smaller government, less legislation and laws, wouldn't that be more freedom and egalitarianism in society?
Not necessarily. How are you restricting the freedom? You could have one fat cat there who owns all the media.
But I was talking about the earlier statement where we were saying that,
Yeah.
that less law, or you were saying that laws inherently limit freedom. They're limiting freedom on someone
Of course.
by definition.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that legislation, basically laws, establish different government agencies, different programs. So if you limited that and you had a solid foundation of egalitarian freedom on an individual level, not on a group level, wouldn't society be equal? And that's what I think the Americans, that their intention was in their constitution. The way it's worked out is 200 years of laws that have every time legislation is passed, it's never
Yeah.
revisited and expires,
Mhm.
right? So over time, every 20 years, you've got how many more bills that go through Congress that are limiting freedom.
I don't see that egalitarianism written in the U.S. Constitution. I see a heavy, heavy emphasis on liberty.
But
It's
But
not
if
like
it's
it's
at
not
an
like,
individual level, though, then it is equal because I get just as much liberty as you do.
no, you don't. We're not all born equal. Some of us inherit millions of dollars. Some of us have advantage that a lot of other people don't have.
But I think the point is that everyone enjoys these liberties is kind of a leveling mechanism for them.
Yeah,
right?
that's
I mean,
that's
it's
what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Their intention was, and
Yeah.
for their liberal democracy.
And if they're born under that constitution, that each person should have an equal playing field, regardless if you inherit those millions of dollars or not, they should have the same opportunity to those same freedoms that everyone else does.
Exactly. So say, and this is why I understand where the drafters of the Constitution were coming from, because if we just established that the more laws you have inherently limit freedom. So now if I was to draft a law that limited inheritance tax, I'm limiting someone's freedom.
Mm-hmm.
It also depends on what
Right.
laws you're drafting. It's not just the amount of
It's
laws.
this weird paradox that you get
Yeah.
into. It's like when we were discussing France, the campaign contributions. I remember having quite quite the discussion about it. About where do you draw the line at? Is $5,000, is that too much? Is that too little? Are you limiting someone's freedom? Are you not giving someone enough freedom? Or is it too much?
Yeah, but the way we went forward, we're dealing with democracy, and we're looking at the will of the people as
Yeah,
a
but
whole.
the will of the people.
That's our
to
goal.
Contribute in that context. You can say the will of
Yeah.
the people in each different context.
So
we're
we
talking
ended
about,
up
we're just trying
arguing
to
that
expand.
they actually should be lower because they're going to promote popular support, and that's going to encourage the will of the people being represented.
Yeah.
So are we saying that democracy can help ensure freedom with the people?
But how do you ensure that freedom with legislation?
I guess that's one way to do it.
Yeah. The end goal of democracy, in my view, is just capturing the will of the people.
But is 51%, is that enough for the will of the people?
Depends on the system, but it's definitely a start.
And do you think that the problem with apathy is that people are disinterested due to the system, or disinterested by nature?
I think it's the system. I think it's the rhetoric. I think it's the repetition.
I agree with you.
I think it's the
systemic.
fact, like in the U.S., you don't have a say. It's either Republicans or Democrats. They're basically the same parties. You hear Bush on TV, you hear Obama on TV talk about freedom and democracy, and they abuse it, and people get cynical. How could you not?
Well, there's this thing on the internet I seen actually, and
that's undermining democracy.
Anyone ever seen those? They basically take a speech and you put it into a computer and it pulls out the words that were said, and they pull up some of George Bush's words or speeches, and like the most used words were freedom, liberty, democracy, and then they compared it with Obama, and his were not the same, but the point was that the most said word that was repeated in almost every sentence was freedom, liberty, democracy.
Yeah, they're all buzzwords.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's what they
Talking
use.
points to a certain extent.
And basically, what we've seen is unlimited freedom, unreasonable freedom, without reasonable limits on it, is counterproductive to democracy
Because it's counterproductive to an egalitarian society.
in terms of capturing the will of the people. Because you have minority groups that take advantage of that, and they interfere with capturing the will of the people.
Yeah, like with democracy, everyone needs to have the same freedom. So having too much restriction or too much openness to the freedom is what is going to what's going to damage the democracy in that.
You got to quantify the exact amount of freedom,
Yeah.
and that's where the difficulty lies.
I don't think it's that difficult, because look at France. They got nearly 92% score. They got 10 out of 10 on Canada and party influence.
Mm-hmm.
They're near 100%. So how?
But 19 of the other 22 countries we've studied don't have the same freedoms that France does.
Because for some reason, if you're in the Middle East, you're completely restricting freedom. So that's a different category there. But in terms of these Western democracies, they're capitalist societies. They have corporate entities that have taken it over. So obviously those people, or people running those society, don't really care about democracy as long as they have the power. I would argue.
And that's where the trouble lies.
I would argue by default they should know this. This is something a reasonable person should know.
What?
That democracy has an egalitarian component to it, and it means there has to be reasonable limits on freedom.
So I think that we could all agree that in order is freedom a qualifier, or can freedom be used as a mechanism to establish an egalitarian society by limiting freedom, or is freedom completely separate?
I think it's just part of it. But I don't think it's in my view, I don't think it's the kernel of democracy. It's just a component.
It's like a byproduct of.
It's a component. Like I call it the three pillars of democracy. Mm-hmm. You got liberty, electoral fairness, and political equality. And they all feed off each other and limit each other, and then you get
There was electoral fairness,
Political equality.
Political equality and liberty.
Yeah, and they're kind of contradictory.
I don't think so. I think
No,
that-
liberty and political equality are offset.
I think all three of those, tenet of all three of those is freedom to a certain extent.
But there's going to be limits.
So
To establish political equality,
for
you're going to have to
liberty-
limit a party.
for liberty, freedom to do what you want in a society. For electoral fairness, freedom to be able to run in a fair and equal environment. And what was the last one?
Political equality.
Political equality.
Yeah.
Right there, political equality, freedom to do your politics and what you want to do.
Within limits.
Yeah.
Within limits, though. That's what I'm saying. Liberty is going to be, because you can't just have a free
Yeah.
reign if you own all.
You
the
got to have the
media.
freedom to do it. So then, if
You do.
if you accept that freedom's a tenet of those three pillars, it's there. It's a necessary condition. Then you've got to establish limits on it in order for them to function properly.
Of course. And same with freedom. There has to be a certain amount of freedom.
So we can
You
look
can
to
switch it
freedom.
around, too.
So we can look to freedom as a mechanism
But you can
to
but you-
establish an egalitarian society as a fundamental
Yeah.
root from divided.
I'm just kind of
down
I'm
from all
kind
three
of
of
cautious
those.
of doing that because I'm seeing the harm of freedom now.
But
In-
I'm saying freedom with constraints, though, right?
it is, but
The constraint being that it's freedom compatible with freedom for all others on that same level.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about the media or corporations, a small group of people impinging on the rights of others, what exactly are they impinging on? I just kind of want to boil this down for myself. So
I'm looking at electoral discourse during an
Okay.
election. They could be having a dominant influence on it, and thereby influencing the outcome of the election.
right,
A huge
So
impact.
having disproportionate
Just
say.
disproportionate, say, influence. Let's say. That's one aspect.
Could you also say that they've had disproportionate freedom that gives them disproportionate?
It would link
say?
into that. As soon as you accept that argument, then it would follow with that. Yeah,
So. Yeah.
yeah.
So it's freedom then that's not compatible with a definition of freedom that works for a democratic society in the first place.
But you need some elements of freedom.
Elaborate on that. Following.
Yeah, good point.
Well, yeah. So you know what? Come back to me on that. I'm gonna
Sure.
think about this for a second. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that freedom can be used as a mechanism.
It can, but also you could use political equality and then link it into the other two.
Mm-hmm.
I see what you're saying there. But the point where
I'm trying to think of a single, simplified to get individual freedom for all, to establish an individual playing field, no group recognition of
Yeah.
democracy. I think that's fundamental.
yeah, I
See-
can see what you're saying. I'm so reluctant because freedom has been so abused.
But I'm saying build on that though with a restraint.
Yeah.
So we got individual freedom, and everyone's got
Yeah.
the same restraints on everyone else. So you don't have to take out the group thing. We already established that's bad. So now if you've got individual freedom, and then constraints on your individual freedom, that wouldn't allow you to hinder freedom of someone else. What are you gonna say?
Right. So those are the boundaries, right?
Yeah,
I
those
mean,
are
the
the
only
boundaries.
boundary on
And
my
then-
freedom is someone else's freedom. So the concept of freedom is
Exactly.
still coherent,
It's
right?
like
within that.
boundaries. They're up against each other, and then on that you can build the three pillars of democracy: the electoral fairness, because it's society's built on a foundation of freedom with constraints.
Yeah.
It's like little asterisks.
I don't know personally myself whether I would draft a constitution for a country that way, but I would include the main components I want in it without putting one superseding the other, because I think that's what's happening in the context of Canada. It says freedom in a democratic society. It's like there's a default bias to freedom, and it's overriding basic democratic principles.
I wouldn't say that's what's overriding the democratic principles, though, in Canadian.
It's not like they're saying
Including
equality. Like
In the
they're putting
discourse.
emphasis on freedom over equality and fairness and etc.
I think the way that our political institutions are organized, though, they favor certain parties and groups. Quebec,
Yeah.
Aboriginals get certain recognition, and this permeates all levels of the Canadian government, from the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
senators. Don't some of them have to be? I could be wrong. You know how many senators? French senators? Maybe not. Maybe not. But anyways, Supreme Court. I know some have to be French. The way the lines are drawn in Quebec, and that's built in the Constitution, right? I'm thinking of more of a
Yeah.
ground-up approach.
No, I totally understand your point, but like I said before, freedom is being abused so much in Western societies.
Mm-hmm. But that's why you have
It makes me hesitant, and I also realize from, if you look at democracy, freedom is only one component of it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, there's other components. So to me, it seems more logical, and then putting unfair emphasis on one component. Why not include all the major components into the foundation?
I think what Dan is saying is are those other components, or the extent of those other components, or the magnitude of those other components, are determined by how much you constrain that one component of freedom.
Can you move that again?
I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
Because you said freedom is kind of the qualifier. It's kind of the mechanism, right?
Yeah.
So the amount of restriction, or the amount of, or the extent of freedom someone has, determines how much equality, or how much liberty, or how much, or liberty and freedom are the same thing, but how much some of the other components are in terms of their magnitude.
Yeah. By defining freedom, you can quantify it, and then it becomes a mechanism whereby society becomes equal.
Because the more you restrain the freedom, then you're providing more equality in a way, right?
Like that was Trudeau's plan with the white paper, was to recognize Aboriginals as the same as everyone else. They've got the same constitutional recognition as everyone else. And then his whole ideal was that, or his whole plan was that this would, by defining everyone equal, it would manifest or push forward a equal society. To kind of get what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you. So you're saying that's what he was trying to do.
Yeah, that's what he was trying to do,
but it didn't happen.
It didn't happen because if there's no interest for a constitutionally recognized group to give that up. Why would you, right?
Mm-hmm.
You'd be crazy.
In terms of the French Constitution, remember they got nearly 92% in terms of electoral fairness. And what is their caption?
Liberty, equality, fraternity? Isn't that?
Liberty, egalitarianism, and
Fraternity?
yeah. So they have three main concepts. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what's happening with you is that you're in Canadian society. There's so much emphasis on freedom. You live right beside the U.S., so maybe you're being influenced.
No, Steve, I don't think you're.
If you
know what I'm saying? I'm
saying I understand.
Constraining freedom. I'm not saying.
No, but hold on a sec,
unconstrained
Dan.
freedom.
But you can take equality and do the same thing. Okay, we're going to start with equality,
But how
and then we're going to. This is how much.
How do you define equality in a way that works for everyone, that establishes that establishes equality? I'm saying the way to establish equality is defining freedom so that freedom can't.
But you can't.
impinge equality.
You can't define freedom.
Right, yeah.
No, but Kyle, you can't define freedom in the same way. You need equality in those other concepts
But
to actually define it.
Okay, but from the moment that you mention some groups on any constitution, there's no equality anymore, okay? So freedom comes after that, because if that group has some more things, or even is only mentioned of a document, a constitution or something, it has a different kind of freedom, perhaps more or less, than the other group. So from that point, there is no equality anymore. And regarding to the fairness of elections, I think the problem here, and that's why we rated for France with a very good rate score. I mean, is because they try to make to reduce the power of money in the elections. So they were trying to make the smaller parties to get easily into the election, and they put a top on how much money people donate, and you are also restricting some freedom there. But it is only in time of elections where they are trying to make everything plain for everybody else.
I think this is something that the Foundation for Democratic Advancement is trying to make sure that they can find out that, I mean, some countries have unlimited freedoms, and that's going to hurt their democratic processes, and some countries, like we just did Saudi Arabia, have zero freedoms, which also affect that democratic process. So I mean, constraining freedoms and giving, like there has to be a give and take at some point where it's, the freedom, it has to be a fair amount of freedom. You can't have too much, you can't have too little.
Yeah,
and I think around the world that's what we're trying to find out.
And that's what actually we're seeing. We got two, at least in terms of constitutions and legislation, we got two really good examples, France and Venezuela, and they're kind of in the middle between this kind of unrestrained freedom, a pocket of countries here, and then the countries that completely limit freedom on the other end. So they're kind of, it's almost like a new spectrum, isn't it? It's not right left, but we're looking at, it's almost a freedom spectrum. So on again, as mentioned, on one endpoint you got unlimited freedom, almost. Another one is you have no freedom.
And what do you have in the middle of it?
The countries that are egalitarian.
Right there.
Right in the middle.
Exactly.
It's fascinating.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
And those are the countries that are doing well in our study.
You said it, man. Right in the middle of that freedom spectrum.
Yeah, fair enough.
You've got egalitarianism.
Fair enough.
So by limiting freedom, boom, equal society.
No, I'm just so tainted by freedom in Western society.
But
how
you're tainted by unlimited freedom.
Yes.
Freedom without restraint.
Yeah,
I'm not talking about freedom without restraint.
I know. I'm just tainted, so I'm kind of fearful that it can also, if I actually advocated that, it's going to go down the same route again, right?
No, and
I can see what you're saying there, and I'm obviously influenced by my societal conditions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, in your examples, are you saying that the Aboriginal people, because they're mentioned in the Constitution, and because the French are mentioned in the Constitution, they have more freedom, in a way? Or they have an up on the rest?
You could say that, yeah. Because they
But there are certain historical factors for that decision, right? For their mention in the Constitution, right? Especially in the case of the Aboriginals, right?
They were founding parties. Both of them were founding parties.
Yes.
They were French and the Aboriginals were here before the current.
The same all over the world too, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But my problem with recognizing groups or even different types of individuals is that it perpetuates that status quo, and it perpetuates those group divisions.
Are there any closing remarks tonight on freedom and democracy?
Just from my standpoint, I think that making sure that freedom has a level playing ground where it's not too much or not too little is essential to making sure that democracy has a fairness in its I guess entire underground that can make it a fair process for that country.
So I think the motivation for that is if people believe in the will of the people and believe in democracy itself, they will want to bring that about, right?
Yes.
But if they're only after their individual interest, they probably won't care, right? Do you agree?
I agree.
So what would change the motivation there?
I think, well, the Constitution should be the first place that helps with that freedom, making sure it's either there or limits whatever's excess. But from there on out, I guess history just basically plays its game. Whoever can make the changes is going to be the ones that helps that democratic process.
So, having said that, there are countries out there that need changes to their constitution.
I believe so.
Sweden?
I didn't do the Sweden audit.
I did. Canada and other ones, right? So even the U.S., the almighty U.S.,
Right.
needs changes.
I completely agree. I think that by establishing a equal playing field of freedom, if you will, by giving everyone equal freedom, that it will be a necessary qualifier for establishing a legitimate democracy that looks out for freedoms, because individuals in that democracy cannot impinge on the freedom of another person.
Also the fairness. It links into the fairness and
I
equality.
think that is the fairness,
Yeah.
by giving everyone
Yeah.
equal amounts
Mhm.
of freedom that is fair.
Yeah. Is there any other comments?
I agree with that. The only thing I want to add was that freedom itself has become this whole philosophical concept where, you know, anyone who questions it becomes something else, becomes the other. And I think that's a big problem where, you know, we have to kind of get over that and accept the fact that that freedom has to be limited in order to create fairness and equality.
Yeah. I would like to thank everyone for coming tonight and thank everyone for listening. This podcast tonight was based on the FDA reports, 22 countries up to now. For anyone listening, interested in learning more about freedom and what the Foundation for Democratic is doing on with its global habits, please visit democracychange.com, and we look forward to you returning for our next month's podcast.